Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 3 of The Silver Chair, The Sailing of the King.
Back to it. Back to Narnia.
Finally, we're finally back in Narnia. We spent the first 2 chapters. I think this is the longest it's taken so far in the 4 books we've read for us to get to Narnia.
Yeah, it felt like such a quick transition because we met our characters and then they were instantly talking about Narnia. And we thought we'd get there. But there was kind of like a purgatory period, if you will. Not really. It's not even a supposal of purgatory.
I was like, the irony of that statement is that they're in Aslan's country, which is, I guess, kind of heaven. So right. It doesn't make sense. It's okay.
I said it intentionally, and I will not refute it.
All right, there you go. So, I guess this is a great place for us to go ahead and begin our chapter summary. Do we have anything to fix from the last 2 chapters? We had so much fun with Jared, didn't we?
And I think we did everything perfect, so we can just start making mistakes in this one.
There we go. All right, well, in our last episode, Jill received instructions, the 4 signs from Aslan, and then he used his breath to blow her off of a cliff down into Narnia, and that is where we will pick up today with chapter 3.
I'm ready. Let's hear it. Wait, hold on. Let me get my word counter ready. Okay, go.
All right. Jill is awestruck by the splendor of Narnia all around her. She observes a beautiful castle, a great ship, and an old king departing for the east. After catching up with Eustace, the two meet a large owl named Glimfeather. The owl identifies the king as Caspian X, Eustace's old friend. Glimfeather takes Jill and Eustace to Trumpkin the dwarf, but the conversation is difficult due to Trumpkin's hearing. That evening, Jill and Eustace are treated royally at the Palace of Cair Paravel. Inside the magnificent fortress, they realize that they have already missed the first sign. Jill and Eustace are frustrated with one another and argue about their present circumstances. However, their irritations quickly subside when they are treated to an enormous feast in the Great Hall. With their stomachs full and their hearts warmed, Jill and Eustace head upstairs to bed.
Well done. One of the most interesting parts about this is that Eustace has actually never been to Narnia before.
I know, isn't that so funny that, obviously he spent all of the last book at sea, and so in some ways he's experiencing this for the first time just like Jill is.
Right. He never got the kind of Narnian hospitality.
Yeah, that's exactly what Lewis says.
Yeah, like we were just talking about, the fact that Eustace isn't even sure this is Narnia. Cause
yeah, that's true.
he was on a ship the whole time. And you feel like because he was around so many people that still kind of counts, but it really doesn't. This is completely different. And on top of that, he doesn't recognize anyone. He can't find that friend that they were talking about.
Yeah, and throughout the whole chapter, he's actually kind of the crabby Eustace that we remember from the beginning of Dawn Treader. Obviously, he's not like a flat-out jerk, but he's very irritable here. I mean, and kind of rightfully so, as he later accuses Jill. She did try to murder him, supposedly. Right. Obviously, she didn't really try to murder him.
That does tend to put people in a bad mood.
Yeah. That line later, I know we're getting in a little ahead of ourselves, but the line where he says, that's right, I said murder and I'll say it again. It's like, this is the Eustace that I love so much.
Right. Speaks his mind.
Oh, yeah. Even though he is reformed, if you will, he still has that he's kind of a cynical character, and he is someone that is very easily frustrated. And that doesn't go away from his personality just because he's been on Dragon. That's kind of part of who he is, and he has to check himself still.
Right. Yeah, the work is still being done on his heart.
Well, let's go ahead and begin our read-through. So we begin the chapter with Jill overwhelmed by the sights in front of her. And I'm going to go ahead and read from the first page of this chapter. Through a cleft in those mountains, which Jill had seen far inland as she approached the land, the sunset light was pouring over a level lawn. On the far side of the lawn, its weather vanes glittering in the light, rose a many-towered and many-turreted castle, the most beautiful castle Jill had ever seen. On the near side was a quay of white marble, and moored to this, the ship. A tall ship with high forecastle and high poop, gilded and crimson, with a great flag at the masthead, and many banners waving from the decks, and a row of shields bright as silver along the bulwarks. The gangplank was laid to her, and at the foot of it, just ready to go on board, stood an old, old man. He wore a rich mantle of scarlet, which opened in front to show his silver mail shirt. There was a thin circlet of gold on his head. His beard, white as wool, fell nearly to his waist. He stood straight enough, leaning one hand on the shoulder of a richly dressed lord who seemed younger than himself. But you could see he was very old and frail. He looked as if a puff of wind could blow him away, and his eyes were watery.
Wonder who that could be.
Yeah. When you first read this, Phil, when did you just figure out that this was Caspian? Did you find out alongside Eustace and Jill, or early on were you like, wait a second, I think I might know who this is?
I think I had my suspicions when they were talking about a prince, and I thought, okay, if this is going to be connected, if Caspian's in here, he's probably not going to be the same age, and I would imagine that the prince is his son, but I wasn't really sure until they talked about it and said for sure.
So are you saying that in last episode you were getting some hints that maybe this would be Caspian, or was it new in this chapter?
No, it was last chapter.
Last chapter you were starting to think it was. That's cool. That's a really fun thing. This is a great surprise and a fun cameo that he appears, even if we don't actually get to hear from him.
Right, and the fact that he leaves, and then they realize that was the old friend. The way that timing works out is just really well done by Lewis.
And Lewis does a great job in the paragraph that I just read, portraying a sense of melancholy. There is a lot of sadness here in the king. And again, at this point, we don't even know who this is. Maybe we're starting to think that it might be Caspian, our old friend, but we're not sure. And here with this beautiful ship docked near the castle, there seems to be this just sense of sadness. You know, it says his eyes were watery, and at multiple times, Lewis points out how old this guy is. He uses the word old 3 different times in this paragraph. And it's not like being old is a sad thing, but it almost, and Eustace will talk about this in a little bit, it almost feels as if Lewis is portraying this kind of king past his prime kind of thing.
Yeah, most of the description goes to describing how old and frail he was,
alongside how beautiful and magnificent this ship is, right?
Yeah, there's a real contrast there, juxtaposing the two together.
And it's nice to have Lewis also describing a ship. We have missed that since this book began.
Right. It's been a long 2 chapters.
So, Phil, I think as this story progresses, there was a part that you wanted to read as well.
Yeah, so shortly after that, we actually, when we were preparing for this, we found out that my version has further and yours has farther.
Yeah, we were looking at, every time as we prepare for the show, Phil and I sit together and we read it word to word to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. And when we did this time,
there was one word that stood out.
No.
What's really funny is that Daniel always accuses me of saying it wrong, which is, given his history, really funny. And then once I insist that my version says the word that I'm saying, then he continues to say that that's wrong. Like, only you have the right version as printed.
Yeah. So here, just a few paragraphs into chapter 3, one of the paragraphs begins with the 2 words, well, at least in my copy, farther back.
So I just wanted to read this part because it has great descriptions of what Jill's seeing. And keep in mind that she has not been here before. Eustace has not been here either, but he has been around Narnians. Further back, in a half circle, stood what Jill at once knew to be courtiers. They were well worth looking at for their clothes and armor alone. As far as they went, they looked more like a flower bed than a crowd. But what really made Jill open her eyes and mouth as wide as they would go was the people themselves. If people was the right word. For only about 1 in every 5 was human. The rest were things you'd never see in our world. Fauns, satyrs, centaurs. Jill could give a name to these, for she had seen pictures of them. Dwarfs, too. And there were a lot of animals she knew as well. Bears, badgers, moles, leopards, mice, and various birds. But then they were so different from the animals which one called by the same names in England. Some of them were much bigger. The mice, for instance, stood on their hind legs and were over 2 feet high. But quite apart from that, they all looked different. You could see by the expression in their faces that they could talk and think just as well as you could. Golly, thought Jill, so it's true after all.
Yeah, this is a big moment for Jill. She has heard Eustace evangelize, if you will, about Narnia, but now she's seeing it for herself. That all these things that he talked about really are true.
Right. What a rapid introduction she's had. She got to meet Aslan right away. She flew through the air, and now she gets to see an entire crowd of people. And contrast that with you see a lamppost, and then you meet one person, and then you go home.
Yeah, when you compare this to Wardrobe, which is such a slow introduction, this is just throwing everything right at you. And that has been the case for the last 2 books. Obviously, now that we're 4 in, we can do a lot more of comparing the different books with one another. And, both Caspian and Wardrobe open rather slowly as far as revealing the land. Like, again, it takes the Peventys a while, even in Caspian, to figure out that they're back in Narnia, and they're not thrown right back into the middle of things. And just to go back, this isn't really an important thing, but it is weird that yours says further back and mine says farther back. I wonder why they made that change. It's communicating the same thing.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting choice to change that one word.
Well, after the description of all that Jill is seeing, she looks over and she realizes that Eustace is there. And Lewis is quick to point out that she has already forgotten all about the signs, even though she just received them, but she's already forgotten all about them and all about Aslan. And instead of reminding Eustace, she makes a comment about, how bad he looks, and he's grumpy at her because, he fell off this cliff. And it's really not a great interaction between the two of them.
Right. And there's a sense of urgency because she forgot for a while, but now they're rushing back to her mind. And she really needs to communicate with him quickly, but it seems like it's going to be a close call.
Exactly. And Eustace is, I don't know anybody here. There's nobody that I recognize. And we obviously know, having finished the chapter, that Caspian is there. They can see him from where they're standing. But, you can't really be frustrated at Eustace here. He's 70 years older.
Right. It doesn't seem like the most fair thing. But Jill does say it's the first person, right?
She says it's the first person. That's what Aslan says. And the book is mostly told from Jill's perspective. And because of that, we really don't know exactly what happened when Eustace landed here. For all we know, maybe as he's flying, obviously we know from Glimfeather that nobody really sees them. But maybe the first person he sees as he's kind of gliding into Narnia is Caspian on the ship. I don't know. I think we'd have to assume that to be the case, because if not, then it meant that Aslan isn't telling the truth, which I don't think is the case.
Right.
So as they're arguing and they realize and they see the king leaving, that is when we are introduced to a new character, Glimfeather the Owl.
Yeah, this is kind of the Hedwig of the group.
I don't think that's true.
No, not at all. But it is an owl. And I love how the word who is incorporated. And there are all these subtle little things, like who were you two? And there are just a lot of those sounds mixed in. And it's even described as a soft hooting kind of voice.
Yes, Lewis is having a great time with writing dialogue for Glimfeather. It's really fun. I imagine that reading this out loud to children would also just be really a delight. And actually, this whole chapter would be fun, especially when we get to the conversation with Trumpkin later on. I can imagine that reading this out loud to your children or to students or just any kid would be a fun thing to do.
Definitely. And even just the way there are these little beats. So, too true, the owl said, sadly shaking its head. And then a little bit later, too who, said the owl, ruffling out its feathers. There are just these little descriptions that remind you constantly that this is a creature that they're talking to. And unlike some of the other creatures who just speak in normal voices, This one is still using a lot of owl characteristics.
That's an interesting point because someone like Reepicheep doesn't make mouse sounds or puns or anything like that.
He talks like squeaking constantly.
Well, it does. Lewis often did use the word like piped or squeaked when saying how Reepicheep talked, but he didn't ever make those actual sounds himself. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
So this is fun that Glimfeather actually carries that in his own manner of speaking.
Yes. In a manner of speaking.
In a manner of speaking. And it is Glimfeather who reveals that the king was Caspian X, at which point Eustace, he becomes an extraordinary color, according to Lewis. And he also points out that the regent that we saw is Trumpkin the dwarf, our old friend who we haven't seen since Prince Caspian.
I didn't realize he wasn't in Don Treader at all.
No, remember, he was back taking care of Narnia in Caspian's absence.
He was mentioned, but we never saw him.
Yeah, he gets a name drop, but we have not seen him since the end of Prince Caspian, and it is wonderful to get to spend more time with him here.
Yeah. I love how even though we're losing two of our main characters, we're still seeing old friends.
Oh, absolutely. It's
dear little friends, too.
Phil, how old do you think Trumpkin is here? Because Eustace, although he could be wrong, makes a comment later on that it's been 70 years. So Caspian's somewhere in his probably mid to late 80s. And Trumpkin, who was alive, he was an adult when Caspian was still a teenager. I mean, he's got to be over 100, right?
Yeah, I would say 110. Just guessing that he was 40 when they first met.
How long do dwarves live? I don't know.
I don't either. I'd say maybe 150 to 170.
Do you have any basis for making this claim, or is this completely a guess?
Well, based on the fact that I think Trumpkin is 110, and it doesn't look like he's about to keel over.
Well, he can't hear anything.
That's true, but that's the first thing to go.
Oh, okay. That's fair.
Maybe he has one of those little trumpet-looking things
that he puts in his ear. Wasn't there one in the Hobbit movie? Didn't somebody have one of those?
Probably.
I don't know. I've tried to block most of the movie out of my head.
Yeah. I had a really good time watching it, but the more I kind of learn about Lord of the Rings and comparing it to the other movies,
yeah.
I don't know if I'll go back and watch The Hobbit.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of fan edits just to see, hey, is there a good movie in there at some point? But I've not been super impressed.
Yeah, I'll just stick to the Star Wars prequels.
There you go. You had to make one mention of it, right? We couldn't do a whole episode without it.
It's in our contract.
Coming up. Yep. So let's actually talk more about Trumpkin here. And, speaking of him being hard of hearing, this is a great conversation, right?
It is, because so much is lost on him.
So I want to read a little bit of it. And I think it's been a while since we got to hear Trumpkin talk. So I want to read the conversation between Glimfeather, Jill, Eustace, and Trumpkin. So the owl approaches Trumpkin, trying to explain who these people are.
"The girl is called Jill,"
said the owl as loud as it could.
"What's that?"
said the dwarf.
"The girls are all killed. I don't believe a word of it. What girls? Who killed them?" "Only one girl, my lord,"
said the owl.
"Her name is Jill." "Speak up! Speak up!"
said the dwarf.
"Don't stand there buzzing and twittering in my ear. Who has been killed?" "Nobody's been killed,"
hooted the owl.
"Who?" "Nobody." All right, you needn't shout. I'm not so deaf as all that. What do you mean by coming here to tell me that nobody's been killed? Why should anyone have been killed?"
"You better tell him I'm Eustace," said Scrub.
"The boy's Eustace, my lord,"
hooted the owl as loud as it could.
"Useless,"
said the dwarf irritably.
"I dare say he is. Is that any reason for bringing him to court, hey?" "Not useless," said the owl. "Eustace." Used to it, is he? Oh, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm sure. I'll tell you what it is, Master Glimfeather. When I was a young dwarf, there used to be talking beasts and birds in this country who could really talk. There wasn't all this mumbling and muttering and whispering.
I'm a big fan of the voices you've been doing. I kind of wish I could take one of your classes.
I do voices, but not as much as I used to when I taught elementary school.
Yeah. You kind of I imagine there are less opportunities if you move up a few grades.
I still do them though when we read some things, but not as much.
Oh. Glad you have this outlet.
Oh, that's why I made the podcast, just so I could do character voices.
Yeah, the secret's out.
What is your takeaway from this conversation? Is it mostly just humorous here?
Yeah, what's funny is there's a real urgency to the situation, but they're also just taking a little bit of time to discuss all this, and it sounds like this is a different dwarf where it's a little harder to communicate with him.
But it still feels like Trumpkin. Again,
Trumpkin's
Trumpkin's a character. I wish we could get more interactions between Trumpkin and Eustace because they have a lot in common. And Trumpkin, although obviously he is a believer in Aslan at this point, we know he's a good dwarf who has, helped Caspian rule for decades upon decades at this point. But he still is kind of a grumpy old man, which is how he was when we met him at the beginning of Caspian. And I enjoy that part about him hasn't changed.
Me too.
In these last few books where we've had characters return at different ages, Lewis has done a good job keeping the personality and the essence of these characters, if you will, while making it feel like time has really passed. That's a hard thing to communicate. It would be really easy for Trumpkin to show up here and feel like a completely different character. We haven't seen him since 2 books ago, and he's now 70 years older. And yet, as we read him, it feels like the same dwarf that we used to know and love.
It does. He's done a good job translating it through the years.
Yeah, it's no small feat. So in this conversation, Trumpkin does learn that it is a son of Adam and a daughter of Eve that show up, and our narrator, Lewis, makes the comment of course, they don't know who that is because people at Experiment House, they hadn't heard of Adam and Eve. And I hadn't even thought about that Eustace, even though he's been to, we ended Dawn Treader with Aslan telling the children, not us, that they needed to learn to know him in their own world. He had a different name here in our world. And I think as I read that, I assume that the Pevensies are able to make that discernment on their own. Oh, wait, we are not told that they are Christians in the books, but we're not told that they aren't Christians. And we are told that like Jill and Eustace are not familiar. And in fact, the Pevensies are familiar with, Adam and Eve. But I had not considered that Eustace, this all might have been lost on Eustace, and that instead of speaking to all 3 of them there, Aslan was really just talking to Edmund and Lucy. And that's why Eustace is invited back, because he still might not know how to learn of who Aslan is in our world. And so that's why he gets to come back as opposed to Edmund and Lucy, who they can figure that out on their own at this point. They're old enough.
That's a good point. Just jog my memory. Where is Eustace located? Where's the school? Like which country?
Well, England. I don't think we're told exactly where Experiment House is. We do know that Harold and Alberta, Eustace's parents, live in Cambridge. But Experiment House to me seems like it is a boarding school. I don't know if it's been explicitly stated that it is, but I think we can assume that it is, especially because Lewis is pulling from some of his own personal background, and he did attend a boarding school. So, it really could be anywhere at that point. I don't think we're given a place for the Experiment House.
I'm just curious what this character may have been based off of. Like, I definitely don't think it's a 1-to-1, match to someone that he knew, but Lucy was definitely inspired by someone and kind of written for someone. I'm curious how much people he knew, how much people Lewis knew played into Eustace.
I have a feeling that a lot of his negative experiences from his own childhood played a role in not just forming Eustace and Jill as students at the experiment house, but also in the whole, right? The gang, the bullies, that some of that is also pulled directly from his childhood. I think we mentioned that, just a couple of episodes ago. I don't know if there's anyone in particular, but there's a lot that he could have pulled from his own experience there.
Yeah, for sure.
So after this conversation ends, Jill and Eustace are set up in the castle of Cair Paravel. This is a great return for us. We have not been here since chapter 17 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's so great to finally return to Cair Paravel. Phil, do you think that this new Cair Paravel is built on the remains of the previous castle, or is this in a different place along the eastern coast of Narnia?
I would think they would just rebuild it where they were.
But wasn't it on an island? Wasn't that the big issue at the beginning of Caspian, that after 1,000 years had passed, when the Pevensey showed back up, the ruins of Cair Paravel were on an island, weren't they?
That's a good point. But the ship seems really close by.
I mean, yeah, you could totally build a castle on an island. I'm not saying it's an island, so obviously it has to be a different place. But Lewis doesn't describe anything about it being on an island. So you're going to take the side of this is on the remains. I'm going to say that it's about a mile away from the original remains or so. They still built it near, but it is not built right on top of the former ruins.
Okay.
Maybe they've turned that into a museum. You can go see the original remains of Cair Paravel. It's like, $15 to get in, and they got these tour guides. And this is where High King Peter sat and stuff.
Take the self-paced audio tour.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. That's what it is. So there is you get those little earbuds that they always say they clean, but I don't trust that.
No.
And you put it in your pocket, you listen to a little cassette tape, and you walk around and see the ruins.
Cassette tape.
So I don't know. What is it, like an MP3 now? I haven't used one of those in a long time.
Yeah, it's not a cassette tape.
Sorry. That's what I want to see. That is the Netflix series I want to see. I want it to be a workplace sitcom about the Narnians who run the Cair Paravel Museum and all the shenanigans they get into and stuff. That's what I want to see.
That'll definitely make it for a season and a half.
It'd be a good season and a half. I'll watch. What would that be, about 30 episodes or so? Oh, if it's on, on network, it's 22 episodes is the norm. But if this is on Netflix, I guess like 8 to 13. So maybe we get to 20 episodes before it gets canceled.
Yeah, they're not going to take the risk of doing 24.
So Phil, tell us a little bit more about what's happening at Cair Paravel.
There's some serious feasting going on. A lot of you know what it really reminds me of? It reminds me of like a glorified version of a medieval festival. Did you ever go to those as a kid?
No, I really wish I had as a kid, but I've never been to one. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this was more like this place seemed to be designed for like school groups to go to, but you could like watch jousting and stuff. But they would serve you half a chicken, like just kind of cooked in the medieval way. It didn't taste very good, but just some of the stuff they're describing here reminds me of that. Like a blind poet came forward and struck up a grand old tale of Prince Cor and Erebus and the horse brie. And I love how Lewis is he is name dropping a book that hasn't come out yet.
Yeah, let's talk about this. Let's pause for a second and talk about this experience that they have at supper. So we get the blind poet, and I wonder if that is in any way some kind of allusion to Homer, who was obviously a blind poet. Yeah, I don't think it works. Simpsons. I don't think it works past that. Well, I mean, there's a lot of references to mythology. There's actually more than just the blind poet connection. But I mean, he is the most. I don't think there's a more famous blind poet in world history than Homer himself. And he's telling this story that has become Narnian myth. in a way. And I don't know a lot about the horse and his boy, but we know that it took place when, Peter and the rest of the Pevensies ruled, which is over 1,000 years ago at this point. So it's almost become this legend, this myth, the same way that Homer stories are Greek myths, right?
Right.
And I wonder how this reads if you're reading Silverchair as the 6th book in the series and have already read The Horse and His Boy. It seems like it still works no matter which order you read them in. In fact, I wonder if it's more exciting to have already read the book here. This is maybe an argument for chronological order, because the only aside that Lewis gives, he says this is what Jack says: "I haven't time to tell it now, though it is well worth hearing." And either way, in my opinion, you could still read that. He's not saying, "Oh, I'll tell you about it later." He's saying, "Hey, I can't tell you about it right now." And I wonder if that would be, I can't speak too much to this because I haven't read the book, but I wonder if that's a fun callback to be like, "Oh, we know that story. That's a fun thing here."
Right. I think this kind of indicates that he's no longer writing one book at a time. I think he is now starting to think of this as a series. I think he might have a plan for more than maybe one more book.
Oh, absolutely. Point. Yeah, that's very true. Well, Phil, any other final thoughts here on this chapter before we wrap up?
The way that this ends, and I'll read the last paragraph. When they were dragging themselves upstairs to bed, yawning their heads off, Jill said, "I bet we sleep well tonight," for it had been a full day, which shows just how little anyone knows what is going to happen to them next.
Wow, ominous.
Can you imagine going through everything that Jill just went through? This is all completely new to her. Eustace has a bit more experience. But going through all of this, being really tired, you just encountered a lion, you found out that you missed your first opportunity, kind of failed the first task. You have a big feast, you're in a castle, and you're really tired and looking forward to going to bed. And just how that would feel. But then we get this ominous kind of note saying like how little anyone knows what is going to happen to them next. Ending this chapter, my thought was, well, at least she'll get a good night's sleep, and then like the next day will be even more exciting. So I'm really curious to see what happens next.
Yeah, that's true. I really enjoy that last bit because the chapter itself has not had a lot of tension except between Jill and Eustace. There hasn't been external tension except for, they missed the sign, but we don't know what any of that means at this point, right?
Right.
The only tension has been between our two leads here, which is enjoyable, and it's such a different approach than what we've gotten in the past books. But then you get that last line, which, she has no idea what's going to happen next. And maybe it's ominous, maybe it's just, a little cheeky to be, oh, look what's, you don't really know exactly what it's going to be, but it is kind of a ... which is a fun way to end the chapter.
Right.
All right, well, I think that's a great place for us to end today.
I agree.
Well, in our next episode, we have Chapter 4, which is entitled A Parliament of Owls. And in that chapter, a gathering of owls discuss how to help the children. All right, Phil, well, before we go, we have an email today from a listener named Anna. So Anna is 14 years old, and she wrote us this email here. She wrote us a wonderful email, and she brought up a theory that I wanted to share with you, Phil. Okay?
Okay.
She says she has a theory about how time works in the books. This is what she says. Through your podcast, I found Pints with Jack and listen. Wait, maybe I don't want to read this. We don't want to give them more listeners, right? We need to hoard them over for
We do.
I'm kidding.
I want to go on the record to say that we want them to have more listeners.
Yeah. Through your podcast, I found Pints with Jack and listened to their season going through Mere Christianity. I really like the way that Lewis describes how time works in relativity to God. He says that if time is a line and we are continuously traveling down it, unable to go in the opposite direction, then God is the page on which the line is drawn, experiencing everything at once. It is for this reason that Christ is walking through every moment with everyone, and it also might give an explanation to Narnia's time. What if our world's time was one line and Narnia's time was another? Then when the children travel to Narnia, there is a connection between 2 points on the lines. Time might be physically worth the same, a second for a second, a day for a day in each world, but either no time or thousands of years could pass between the children's visit to and from Narnia, depending on which points on the 2 lines are connected. I might be overanalyzing this, but these things are fun to think about. What do you think about that, Phil?
That's pretty fun.
That is such a cool description. I'm imagining these 2 lines here that run parallel to another, and from our world to another, they don't just go kind of straight down, meeting as perpendicular lines at 90-degree angles, but instead maybe it's a 45-degree angle, and that's why from our world to Narnia here in this book, and that's why 70 years have passed, because of that's a really great way to put this. Anna, I love that. That's genius.
I think I'm going to be visualizing that when I think about how the time is connected from now on.
Yeah, it's a really cool way to think about it, because we're not given any kind of explanation. And I don't necessarily know if I want Lewis to give us one, if I'm sitting here like, oh, I just wish he'd explained exactly how this works. I'm fine with magic. That's a fine explanation. But it is cool to break this down a little bit, like Anna has done, and think about how maybe it does actually work. And it's a really great description that she's given. And I think we've even talked about that chapter of Mere Christianity once before. I can't remember, but I feel like at some point over the last few seasons we've brought up that chapter that Lewis has on time in Mere Christianity. Also, and then shout out to Matt and David for that episode they did as well too.
Well, I'll wrap us up from here. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, and Emily Margaret for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. You can follow us in the Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages. If you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. thenarniapodcast@gmail.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. A review on Apple Podcasts would also be appreciated. Helps other people find the show. And we thank you for coming along on this journey. We'll be back next time with Chapter 4.